Rain ran down Charlotte Murphy's neck in icy threads and gathered beneath her collar, and by the time she reached the fruit stalls at the edge of Covent Garden, her sleeves clung to her forearms like wet paper. She shifted the basket against her hip. 12 pairs of gentlemen's cuffs, mended by lamplight until her eyes blurred, sat beneath a folded cloth that had once been white, the wicker bit into her palm. Her right boot opened again at the seam. Mud entered at once, cold and gritty, rubbing the skin above her heel raw with every step. She did not stop. Stopping meant feeling the hunger in full. Voices rose around her in the market's wet confusion. Porters shouted prices over wheels grinding through puddles. A woman laughed too loudly under an awning while a boy with a cart swore at a horse that would not move. Steam from chestnut braziers mixed with the smell of soaked wool, onions, manure, and coal smoke from distant chimneys. Charlotte stood in it all, 22 and shivering, waiting for a draper's apprentice to inspect her stitching with fingers cleaner than hers, would be for weeks. He turned each cuff as though searching for rot. 3 pence for the lot, he said. Her stomach clenched so hard it hurt beneath her ribs. You paid 6 last Tuesday. Last Tuesday the thread did not show. The thread does not show now. He looked at her face as if the answer had been contained there all along, dark hair escaping its pins, cheeks drained pale by cold, eyes too large, Lady Penmere liked to say, for any expression worth seeing. He set the cuffs down and shrugged. 3 pence, or take them back. She took 3. She thanked him for it. Her fingers trembled as she tied the coins into the corner of her kerchief. 2 ladies in plum silk paused not 10 feet away, their parasols tilted against the rain. One recognised her. Charlotte saw the flicker of it before the whisper reached her. That is Lady Penmere's stepdaughter. The plain one? The troublesome one. Their gaze held the same tidy cruelty as polished silver. She knew the shape of it, pity sharpened into satisfaction, curiosity dressed as concern. She moved on before they could look longer, but their laughter followed her across the lane, light as birds and no less cutting. By the last week of March she had learned which cobbles in Covent Garden sank under standing water, and which let her pass with only a thin splash. She walked the higher line through the square from habit and from fear. A fall would ruin the cuffs, and ruined cuffs meant no bread. Her left hand burned where lye had cracked the skin at the knuckles during morning wash, and rain found every split, turning each one into a clean, bright sting. She wrapped that hand in the edge of her mantle when she could, though the fabric was so thin it warmed nothing. At a baker's side window she paused, only to measure, only to look. Small loaves sat on a board behind glass clouded by steam, golden crust, flour dust, a fragrance so rich it made her light-headed. She touched the knot in her kerchief through the wet cloth of her skirt. 3 pence would purchase bread for tonight, and perhaps a little dripping if she asked at closing, and endured the look that came with asking. She walked on. Lady Penmere had said she was expected at home with ribbon from the mercer and lamp oil from Drury Lane by supper bell. Bread could wait. Defiance had a cost. She knew the arithmetic too well. A hansom splashed filthy water over the hem of her brown dress as it turned too sharply near the opera colonnade. The driver did not apologise. Men in good coats drew their boots away from her skirts with expressions of annoyance, as though the rain itself had chosen poor cloth to cling to, and she had offended them by wearing it. A boy carrying hat boxes stared openly at the frayed edge of her mantle, and then at her face trying to marry ruin to breeding. She lowered her eyes and stepped aside for everyone. She had been trained to move around comfort like a ghost around furniture. It had not always been thus, though memory had become dangerous in recent months, a sweetness that weakened her knees. Dorset came back to her in flashes while she crossed London streets. A bright morning, at a desk by a window. Her father's hand tapping a ledger margin, ink on his thumb. Columns are honest when men are not, he had told her, patient and grave, letting her recast totals until they balanced to the farthing. Then fever, then silence in a room that smelled of vinegar and wilted lavender, then a winter with no coal that lasted forever, then Lady Penmere, rustling into their hall in costly silk with rose water at her throat and sympathy arranged upon her mouth like trim on a gown. Charlotte turned into Maiden Lane and nearly stumbled on the broken stone at the corner. She caught herself against a wall slick with rain and let her head rest there one moment too long. Her body had begun to keep its own ledger now. Bruises at upper arm from a grip too hard. Ache in shoulders from carrying pails up 2 flights before dawn. Cramps from missed meals. The faint buzzing at the edge of hearing that came when she stood too fast. All itemised, all unpaid. She straightened before the dizziness could darken into collapse, and moved again, because collapse in public would be called display, and display in Lady Penmere's house earned punishment. At the mercer she waited behind 2 housemaids choosing ribbon for a christening bonnet. The shop was warm. The warmth made her shiver harder. The man behind the counter handed her the narrow black roll Lady Penmere had specified and held out his palm before she could speak. "Payment! Charge it to Penmere House, if you please." Lady Penmere asked, "Lady Penmere's account is closed." He said it with professional courtesy, loud enough for the maids to hear, quiet enough to imply delicacy. Their eyes slid toward her and away again. Charlotte swallowed. "I will return," she said, "with coin." She stepped back into rain that seemed colder now than before she had tasted warmth. Her breath smoked pale in the damp air. Account closed. She did not know whether Lady Penmere had known. She did not know which outcome was worse. On Bow Street a constable passed beneath an arch and did not glance at her. 2 gentlemen argued under a shared umbrella about a wager lost at cards. A flower seller called to her with a false smile, offering violets she could never buy. Somewhere nearby a church bell struck the 1/4 hour, muffled by weather and distance. The city moved without pause around her thin frame, vast and indifferent, and Charlotte felt in her bones the truth she had been made to practice. A woman with no dowry and no ally was weather herself, endured or ignored according to convenience. She carried the oil flask against her chest beneath her mantle to keep it from slipping, and as she walked she recited numbers to steady herself. Rent due from the tenant at the old Dorset orchard before it had been sold. Interest rates her father had marked in red, names of trustees, dates beside signatures that did not match the hand she remembered. She recited them because the recitation prevented tears, and because memory could still serve where petition had failed. No magistrate would listen to Lady Penmere's ungrateful stepdaughter when Lady Penmere smiled and spoke of nerves and female fancies. Yet facts did not lose their shape because a room refused them. Facts waited. At night she copied those facts by candle end into narrow books no bigger than prayer volumes. She wrote on scraps cut from old correspondence and sewed the pages into rough gatherings with thread pulled from worn hems. She wrapped the books in linen and pushed them deep into the mattress ticking of the attic truckle where no one in silk would ever search. That hidden weight beneath her sleep had become the nearest thing to safety she possessed. Proof lived there. Her father had not squandered all. He had been deceived. She traced each line until the pattern stood clear as window lead. The rain thickened toward evening. Water streamed from roofs in silver cords and drummed on carriage tops, so hard it blurred the street lamps to trembling stars. Charlotte crossed the square toward the posting yard with empty basket, oil flask, and 3p knotted tight at her side. Her toes were numb. Her jaw ached from clenching against cold. She could no longer feel 2 fingers on her left hand. When she flexed them, pain flashed white and immediate, then faded to dull heat. At the yard gate, hostlers shouted over stamping horses. Lantern lights swung in a gust and painted the mud bronze for an instant. A black carriage stood beneath the overhang, lacquered panels gleaming wet in the storm, crest bright on the door. Not a hired hack, not a merchant's cart. A noble household's carriage with matched bays, polished harness, and a footman in dark livery waiting in rigid stillness as though the weather answered to him. Charlotte slowed without meaning to. The footman looked directly at her. Her name in such a place would be a summons or a sentence. The footman stepped out from beneath the overhang as if he had been waiting for that exact heartbeat, rain sheeting off the brim of his hat and running in clean lines down a coat that cost more than Charlotte's winter of meals. And when he bowed, his voice carried through the yard with practised clarity. "Miss Murphy, his lordship requests your immediate attendance." Several heads turned at once. A hostler stopped buckling a trace. A maid with a basket of kindling stared openly, her gaze moving from Charlotte's split boots to the crest on the carriage door and back again, measuring the distance between those 2 facts and finding no polite way to bridge it. Charlotte felt the old heat of shame climb her throat despite the cold, felt the wet cloth of her chemise stick to her spine, felt the 3p at her hip as if each coin had become a stone tied to her body. "You have mistaken me," she said, because refusal had to begin as error if one wished to survive it. The footman did not blink. "No, Miss Charlotte Murphy of Penmere House." He opened the carriage door 1 hand's width. Lamplights spilled over dark leather seats and brass fittings dry as a drawing room, a small bright chamber cut out of the storm. The smell reached her even through wet wool. Beeswax, good tobacco, clean horse. Not the sour damp of public coaches. Not the rough boards of market carts where men put their boots against one another's knees. She had ridden in that kind of comfort when she was a girl, and her father was still alive and laughing at her sums, when her gloves had been mended before the seams broke, and no one in Dorset had yet discovered how quickly a household could be rearranged after one grave and then another. A summons from rank, delivered in rain, did not come to women like her as rescue. It came as test or trap or bargain written in terms she would only learn once the carriage door shut behind her. The yard seemed to lean in. Water struck the shingles overhead in hard, unbroken rhythm. "My lord is not accustomed to waiting," the footman added, not cruelly, not kindly, simply as one states the weather. Charlotte's fingers tightened around the basket handle until the wicker bit through skin already split by lie, and the pain steadied her enough to remember that men with titles were never trained to ask powerless women what price they could bear. Her father had taught her that numbers revealed character long before death taught her what grief revealed, and in the first months after he was taken by fever, she had still believed the world kept some faithful proportion between merit and outcome. In Dorset, he had carried account books from room to room as other men carried newspapers, sleeves rolled, spectacles low on his nose, a careful man who paid labourers on Thursdays, and checked weights himself at harvest, because fairness, he said, could not be delegated. She had been 19 when the coughing began, and still foolish enough to think vinegar cloths and watchful nights could halt the progression of a disease that moved through villages like smoke through rafters. By the second week of his illness, he could no longer hold a pen without shaking. By the fourth, he could not rise from bed. He died in rain not unlike this, and the priest spoke of providence while creditors waited at the gate before the earth had settled. Her mother had been buried 2 winters earlier, and in the stunned season after that first funeral, her father married the widowed Lady Penmere in what the neighbours called prudent haste. Charlotte, still reeling from loss, mistook polished concern for safety. Lady Penmere arrived with rose water at her throat, trunks of silk in 3 carriages, and legal papers folded inside a velvet reticule she kept always at her wrist. Charlotte remembered the first evening at Penmere House as a sequence of small displacements that never reversed. Her mother's portrait removed from the morning room and replaced by a hunting print. Her father's desk sent to an upstairs landing because it darkened the library. Her own keyring requested for household efficiency. Her name changed in introductions from Miss Murphy to our Charlotte, then to the girl, then to no name at all. When her father died, Lady Penmere took formal command of every account tied to Charlotte's maintenance, and the signature on the trust documents looked right until one compared it with letters written before morning had thinned his hand. Charlotte compared them. Charlotte kept copies. Charlotte learned very fast that truth did not defend itself, and that a plain young woman without dowry could present proof to men in wigs, and receive in return patient smiles and advice to avoid excitement. Cruelty in that house had seldom required a raised voice. It lived in portions reduced and errands extended, in being sent to purchase ribbon on an account already closed, so clerks could deny her in public, in being told to stand behind screens while callers praised Lady Penmere's management, and then called for tea Charlotte had brewed from leaves used twice already. The Penmere sisters, bright and soft-skinned, and always scented faintly of orange blossom, wore Charlotte's mother's pearl combs, as though they had been born to them. One took her winter cloak and declared the colour too severe for a younger face, then had the seamstress narrow the waist and let Charlotte watch the fitting. The other discovered Charlotte's school French grammar in a drawer, and laughed through the pronunciation at breakfast until the pages were ordered to the nursery for scrap. Letters addressed to Charlotte from Dorset ceased arriving. She found one, months later, beneath a stack of sheet music in the small drawing-room. Seal broken, content harmless, date old. Lady Penmere denied opening it and then remarked that correspondence distracted girls from practical duty. At table, Charlotte sat after everyone else and rose before they had finished, because she was useful when silent and impertinent when visible. When guests asked whether she would make a match, Lady Penmere answered for her. Our Charlotte has a talent for economy. She keeps our household from waste. Laughter followed every time. Sometimes a hand closed around Charlotte's upper arm hard enough to leave finger marks hidden by sleeve cuffs, always where no one respectable would be required to notice. Once, when she refused to alter a tally in the conservatory account, she went without supper and then without breakfast, not as punishment, Lady Penmere said, but as correction against hysteria. Hunger made the staircase sway by midday. Hunger also clarified priorities. Charlotte stopped wasting breath on appeals and began spending hours in the attic by candle end, copying entries from ledgers she was not permitted to audit, tracing dates of transfers, listing creditors whose amounts rose though payments had supposedly been made, marking in neat columns the pattern by which trust funds designated for her clothing, instruction, and eventual settlement vanished into notes tied to gaming clubs and milliners who served only Lady Penmere. She hid those pages in mattress ticking because locked drawers were searched and books upon shelves were considered communal property when she claimed them. She did not weep except once, when she found her father's field key sold with a lot of old brass. She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand and finished the washing before dawn. Rain splashed up from the yard and struck her shins, hauling her back to the footman waiting with door open and posture rigid, the world reduced again to mud, lantern smoke, and the hard, bright emblem of a house she did not know. "Who is his lordship?" she asked, though she had no right to ask, and both of them knew it. "The Earl of Harrow." The title travelled through the yard faster than the rainwater down the gutter, and the hostler who had been staring lowered his eyes at once. Charlotte had heard the name in the same rooms where she served dishes without being seen. War service, iron discipline, an estate in the north run like a regiment and solvent to the last acre. A man who did not attend roots unless compelled and left before dancing began. None of that altered the central arithmetic. An earl's request carried consequences, whether accepted or refused. Acceptance promised enclosed warmth and unknown terms. Refusal promised open cold and terms she already understood. She thought of the door's brass step, polished by use, and of every door at Penmere House where she had been told to wait outside until summoned. She remembered Lady Penmere's smile when discussing female gratitude, as if it were both ornament and debt. She pictured her ledgers hidden under ticking, and how swiftly a single rumour could turn their maker from inconvenient dependent into proved liar. The footman shifted, not impatient, merely aware of time and rank moving around him like currents he had been trained to navigate without question. "Miss Murphy," he said softer now, "the weather worsens." Charlotte looked at the carriage interior one final moment, then stepped back so that the rain hit her full in the face and washed away the brief scent of wax and leather. "You will return to his lordship with my thanks," she said. Her voice shook once and steadied. "Tell him I do not attend gentlemen at night in storms without written cause." The maid with the kindling inhaled sharply. The hostler muttered a prayer or a curse. The footman's expression altered by a fraction, not quite surprise, not quite respect. Then he inclined his head, as if receiving instructions from someone whose station required obedience, though both of them knew that courtesy was a gift he could retract the moment he chose. "As you wish, miss." He closed the door. The latch clicked with the finality of a lock set from outside. Horses stamped, reins snapped taut. Wheels turned and sliced through standing water, and in seconds the black carriage rolled out into Bow Street rain, carrying no passenger, no explanation, and no guarantee that the choice she had made would leave any part of her life untouched. Charlotte stood until the lantern glow vanished at the corner, then lifted her empty basket, gathered her thin mantle at the throat, and walked toward Penmere House through a city that had just watched her refuse safety she could not afford to trust. Charlotte kept her eyes on the slick line of cobbles and walked until the market noise thinned behind her, and Penmere House rose out of rain like a judgment. The front windows glowed amber. Laughter spilled from the drawing room when the wind shifted, bright and muffled, while she stood at the servants' entrance with water running from her skirts to the step. She set down her basket and knocked once. The door opened only far enough for Mr. Cray, the butler, to present his narrow face and colder eyes. "You are late." "The mercer would not extend credit," she said. "He said Lady Penmere's account is closed." Mr. Cray's mouth tightened, not in surprise, in caution. "Come." He led her through the back passage where steam from the kitchens turned the air wet and heavy, through a corridor lined with polished copper she was never permitted to touch unless ordered, and into the morning room where no morning softness had ever survived Lady Penmere's presence. Rosewater reached Charlotte before she crossed the threshold. Lady Penmere stood at the hearth in silver-grey silk, one gloved hand resting on the mantel, as if she were posing for a portrait. Arabella lounged on a chaise with embroidery she never finished. Clarice stood at the window, turning a strand of pearls against her throat and watching Charlotte in the glass instead of directly. "The ribbon," Lady Penmere said. "There was none," Charlotte answered. The account was closed because I closed it." Lady Penmere turned then, and her smile was neat as pinning. "I wished to see whether you would invent a lie before strangers, or merely fail in silence. You have chosen silence. How dull!" Rain rattled against the panes. Charlotte could feel water still dripping from her hem onto the carpet, and wanted, with a force that startled her, to step backward and leave no trace of herself in that room. Arabella laughed softly. "Is it true," Clarice asked, "that Harrow's carriage waited for you like a proposal in the mud?" Charlotte's breath caught. So the yard had spoken quickly. Lady Penmere watched her face and took the answer she needed from that single flinch. "You declined an Earl's summons while carrying my errands in rags. You have managed to insult rank and embarrass this house in one wet afternoon. Efficient for once." "I did not use your name." "You used my roof." Lady Penmere's voice sharpened. "You will not be seen in Covent Garden tomorrow or the next day. Mrs. Greeley at the King's Lantern has lost 2 kitchen girls to influenza. You will take their place for dawn service and remain until I decide your return is useful. You may sleep there in the scullery loft and earn your board by your hands, since your judgment has proven costly." Charlotte stared at her, rainwater cooling on her skin, and understood the arrangement at once, exile without calling it exile. Punishment that looked like prudence. A way to keep her out of sight while talk of the carriage travelled through drawing rooms and card tables. "I have duties here," she said quietly. Lady Penmere crossed the room in 2 steps and struck her with the back of her glove. Not hard enough to bruise deeply, hard enough to burn. "Your duty is obedience," Lady Penmere said. "Pack 1 dress. Leave by the rear gate in 10 minutes. If you are seen in this corridor when my guests depart, you will go without references." Charlotte tasted iron where her teeth had caught her cheek. She did not lift a hand to it. She bent her head once because witnesses stood within earshot, and survival still required theatre. "Yes, Lady Penmere." She went upstairs by the narrow servants' stair, each tread groaning under wet boots. In the attic room she stripped off her soaked mantle and wrung it over the basin, then opened the mattress seam with a hairpin and drew out 2 stitched ledgers wrapped in linen. Her fingers shook from cold and fury, but she wrapped the books again, bound them tight with twine, and tucked them beneath her spare chemise in the small valise that had belonged to her mother. She added 1 dress, 1 apron, a comb with 2 missing teeth, and her father's brass ruler no one had thought worth stealing. Then she stitched the mattress closed with rough thread, because habit did not yield even now. By the time she reached the rear gate, the rain had thickened into a hard grey curtain that erased distances and made every lamp halo and blur. She walked east with the valise striking her knee and the welt on her cheek warming under the cold. The city had entered that hour when taverns emptied and bakeries lit, when drunks leaned in doorways and milk carts rattled towards squares where servants would soon queue with pails. Her stomach cramped once, then again. She passed a church porch where a woman slept upright against stone and did not look long, because looking too long felt like prophecy. By the time St. Paul's bells marked 4, Charlotte had reached the King's Lantern coaching inn, a broad, smoke-blackened building near the turnpike, where travellers slept in rooms too expensive for her, and stable boys dozed on sacks of chaff when they could. Mrs. Greeley met her in the yard with arms folded beneath a flower-streaked apron and eyes that weighed utility in a blink. "Pen me a girl? Yes, ma'am. Can you pluck, gut, carry, and keep your mouth shut? Yes, ma'am. Then tie your hair and take that station. Pies to set, kettles to scrub. Wages weekly, if you last." The kitchen heat hit Charlotte like a hand to the face. Coal fire, boiling stock, singed feathers, onion and yeast and wet wool steaming from men's coats hung near the range. She worked without speaking, plucked geese until her fingertips burned, hauled 2 pails of water from the pump where sleet stung her scalp through loose pins, scrubbed iron pots black with yesterday's grease until her shoulders throbbed. The scullery maid showed her where the chipped cups were stacked, and where not to stand when the cook turned with a knife. Someone shoved half a heel of bread into her hand near dawn. She swallowed it in 3 bites and kept moving. The inn had begun to fill with coach passengers, taking broth before first light when the intrusion came like a musket crack through routine. Hoofbeats hammered into the yard at full pace. Not 1 horse, 4. Wheels skidded, men shouted. A door slammed hard enough to shake soot from the rafters. The kitchen paused in one collective flinch before sound rushed back twice as loud. Mrs. Greeley cursed, wiped her hands, and strode toward the passage. Charlotte followed because everyone followed when urgency carried rank at its heels. Rain blew through the yard arch in silver lashes. The same black carriage stood there, bays heaving, harness glittering with the water. A groom jumped down. Another man swung the carriage door wide. A young courier, perhaps 18 and white with pain, sagged between 2 footmen, his sleeve dark and wet from shoulder to elbow where cloth had torn. He was conscious, jaw clenched, boots dragging in the mud. Then the tall man stepped out behind him, rain-dark greatcoat flaring, hat gone, dark hair plastered back from a scar that ran pale along his temple. He moved with the controlled speed of someone accustomed to command and to emergencies that punished delay. His eyes swept the yard once, taking in doorway, floor, bodies, exits, and landed on Charlotte with cold precision. "Boiling water, now!" The order cut through the rain like steel through canvas. Men moved before they thought. Mrs. Greeley snapped at 2 lads. Someone ran for linens. Charlotte had already turned toward the kitchen, skirts gathered, feet sliding on wet stone. She did not feel the cold. She felt only the old training of crisis: list, prioritize, act. Water, clean cloth, needle, spirits for tools, not for the patient. She seized the big copper kettle, slammed it onto the fire, dragged a tub closer with a screech over brick, and called for salt in a voice she did not recognize as her own. When she looked up again in the passage, the Earl of Harrow stood 3 steps away with rain on his lashes, and the wounded courier leaning against his arm. He was taller than memory from distant rooms had allowed, broad through shoulder and chest, jaw cut hard, face set in that controlled stillness men wore when panic would kill faster than injury. "You!" he said. She met his gaze though her hands were shaking. "My lord! You refused me. I refused uncertainty, my lord." Something flashed in his expression, not anger alone, recognition sharpened by circumstance. Behind him the courier's knees buckled. Charlotte moved at once, slid under the young man's weight with another groom, and guided him onto a bench near the fire. "Cut the sleeve," she said to no one and everyone, "not over the wound, along the seam." A footman fumbled for a knife. Harrow passed him his own without looking away from Charlotte. She took it, split the cloth, and saw at once that the injury was a deep graze along the upper arm, ugly but clean, likely from shattered glass or a glancing shot rather than a lodged ball. The relief hit so fast it made her breath rough for a second. Treatable, painful, not fatal if handled well. A stableman thrust a bottle toward the courier's mouth. Brandy for the shock. No, Charlotte caught his wrist. He is febrile. You will worsen him. Cloth first. The stableman bristled. Since when does a kitchen girl? Since now, Harrow said, and the man stepped back. The kettle began to rattle. Steam rose in white twists. Charlotte poured water into a basin, added cold to temper it, cleaned the wound with careful pressure while the courier hissed through his teeth and gripped the bench edge. She asked his name. Thomas Reed, messenger in Harrow employ. Fell against splintered panel when wheel struck stone at speed. No dizziness, no vomiting. Pulse quick but steady under her fingers. She worked fast. Rinse, compress, stitch where skin had parted widest, bind, recheck warmth in fingers below the wrap. She had learned such things from necessity and from old Mr. Bell in Dorset, who had set broken wrists for tenant boys and once told her that steadiness saved more lives than brilliance ever did. She heard every sound in the kitchen and none of it. Pans, striking grates, rain on slate. Mrs. Greeley arguing with a coachman over spilled oats. Harrow saying nothing at all. When she tied the last knot, she realised he had not moved from where he stood in the doorway. One gloved hand braced against the jamb, water dripping from his sleeve onto the boards. Watching, measuring. Thomas managed a hoarse, "Thank you, miss." "You will keep the arm elevated," Charlotte said. "No lifting today. If fever rises, send for a surgeon at once." Harrow stepped forward at last. Up close, his eyes were not merely grey. They were the colour of winter surf, dark at the centre, edged pale and hard. He looked at the bandage, then at her hands, reddened and cracked and now marked with someone else's blood diluted by water. "You have done this before," he said. "Yes, my lord. Where? Where there was no one else." For a moment the room seemed to contract to the space between them. Her wet hair had come loose and clung to her throat. Her dress, borrowed from Mrs. Greeley and too thin at the sleeves, stuck to the line of her shoulder. She became aware of herself as he might see her. Bruise yellowing near one wrist where cuff had ridden back. Cheek flushed on one side from Lady Penmere's glove. Exhaustion held together by will. His gaze stopped on the mark along her cheekbone. Then on her wrists. Then returned to her face with that same brutal steadiness. "You are covered in bruises." Heat shot through her, part shame, part anger at being catalogued like damage in an inventory she had not offered for inspection. "I bruise easily." "Liar." The word was quiet, not theatrical, not kind. A statement placed between them like a blade laid flat on a table. Charlotte straightened to her full height, which still left her looking up at him. "You summoned me at night with no explanation, my lord. You ask for truth while travelling under secrecy and bringing injuries through storm. We are both keeping back what we can." A murmur passed through the doorway where inn servants pretended not to listen. Harrow's mouth tightened by a fraction, not quite a smile, not offence either. Assessment: "You speak beyond your station." "I have none left to lose." Rain thudded harder on the yardstones. Somewhere behind them a horse screamed once and was soothed. Harrow removed his gloves finger by finger and handed them to a waiting man without looking away from Charlotte. "Dry clothes," he said to Mrs. Greeley, "for Miss Murphy. Broth, bread, a room with a lock." Mrs. Greeley blinked, then bobbed. "Yes, my lord." Charlotte set down the bloodied cloth and wiped her hands in hot water until they stung. "I am employed here now," she said. "You do not command my lodging." He answered in the same clipped register he had used in the yard. "I command my household safety. Thomas stays. You stay until he is stable." I am not of your household. His jaw flexed. You stepped into it when you took my man's pulse. She should have refused on principle alone. She should have walked back to the sink and let rank pass over her like weather, as she had trained herself to do. Instead, she looked at Thomas, pale but breathing easier. Then at the rain flooding the threshold. Then at Harrow standing very still, as if stillness were all that held something volatile in place. "If I stay," she said, "there will be written terms." "Name them." "No private interviews behind locked doors. No removal from this inn without my consent. Payment for skilled care, entered in the inn ledger, in full view." A coachman in the hall gave a startled bark of laughter and then choked it off when Harrow turned his head slightly. "Done," Harrow said. He stepped aside so she could pass toward the kitchen hearth, and when she moved by him she felt, despite the cold, the contained heat of his body and the iron discipline in the way he gave her room without yielding authority. Power remained where it had always been, lodged in title and money and men who obeyed at one word. Yet a different fact now stood beside it. He had seen her work. He had named what others denied. And he had agreed to terms from a woman he could have ignored. Charlotte took the bowl Mrs. Greeley pressed into her hands and drank standing, broth scalding her tongue, while Harrow dictated instructions to his secretary for the ledger entry she had demanded. Outside, rain kept falling, relentless and cold, but inside the King's Lantern the balance had shifted by one hard, undeniable degree. The entry was made in a broad inn ledger, with Thomas Reed's name, the hour, the nature of the injury, and a line in Harrow's secretary's careful hand that read, "Payment to Miss Charlotte Murphy for skilled attendance, by order of the Earl of Harrow." Harrow sanded the wet ink himself and closed the book with 2 fingers, as if sealing a compact in public were as natural to him as drawing breath. Charlotte set down her empty bowl and went back to the bench where Thomas sat with his arm propped on a folded blanket. His face had regained a little colour. His lashes were clumped with rain. He looked very young now that pain no longer clenched every feature. "Does your hand tingle?" she asked. "A little, miss." "Open and close your fingers." He did. Slow but full movement. She nodded, then shifted the sling she had made from a torn strip of her own spare apron. The cloth looked pitiful beside Harrow's fine wool coat, hanging to dry near the range. But it held. Thomas swallowed and glanced toward the Earl, as if apologising for existing. "You did not fail him," Charlotte said quietly. Thomas blinked. "I overturned his dispatch case. Papers near went into the mud." "You kept hold of the case while half fainting. That is not failure." He gave a weak, startled laugh, and then winced at the pull in his shoulder. Charlotte poured him water and waited until he drank. At the passage door, Harrow stood in profile, speaking low with his secretary about axle repairs and a changed route. He did not look at her. He looked at nothing directly near her, which was another form of attention she had already learned to feel. She adjusted Thomas's bandage one final time and rose. "I require fresh willow bark and clean linen," she said to Mrs. Greeley. "And no one gives him spirits." Mrs. Greeley grunted. "You would order my kitchen now." "I would keep your guest alive so he does not die in your best room." The older woman stared at her for one heartbeat, then barked at a scullion to fetch what was needed. Charlotte moved to the scullery pump and scrubbed her hands again until the knuckles flared red. Hot water hit cracked skin and made her breath hitch. She kept washing. Lie had taught her that pain could be sorted, endured, placed aside. By the time the kitchen clock struck 6, dawn had gone from black to iron grey, and the rain had thinned to a needling mist that rattled against shutters instead of hammering them. Coaches came and went. Travellers stamped mud across the front hall and shouted for tea. The inn stretched around Crisis and absorbed it, as places of trade always did. A surgeon arrived at Harrow's summons, coat flung over nightclothes, wig askew. He examined Thomas with brisk scepticism, and then with growing concentration, pressing along the wound, checking the stitch line, testing pulse and pupils. Charlotte stood near the hearth with folded hands and said nothing until asked. "Who cleaned this?" the surgeon said at last. "She did," Thomas answered, nodding towards Charlotte. The surgeon looked up, surprised enough to forget courtesy. "You?" "Yes," he sniffed once, as if rearranging an opinion. "The closure is sound, better than most field work I have seen this season. Keep the dressing dry. Fever watch for 2 days." Harrow inclined his head. "You are satisfied?" "I am," the surgeon said. "Who trained her?" Charlotte answered before Harrow could. "Necessity, sir." The surgeon gave a short hum and left with his fee. Thomas was settled in an upstairs chamber with 2 blankets, a coal scuttle, and strict instructions repeated twice. Harrow assigned one of his men to sit the doorway and sent his secretary to copy dispatches spoiled by water. For the first time since the carriage skidded into the yard, the room's urgency dropped from a shout to a hum. Charlotte lifted a tray of cups and carried it toward the tap-room because movement prevented thought from uncoiling too far. She had eaten broth. She had warmth in her limbs again. She had for one strange morning spoken terms aloud and heard them accepted. None of that made her safe. The tap-room was crowded, teamsters near the fire. 2 clerks arguing over tolls. A widow with a valise asleep at the table, cheek on folded arms. Charlotte set cups, cleared trenches, avoided elbows. At the far end, Harrow sat alone with untouched coffee, reading a water-stained dispatch held flat beneath one broad hand. Even seated, he looked built for command, shoulders filling the narrow chair, face carved into stillness by long habit. Men gave him room without seeming to notice they did it. She turned away before his eyes could rise to find hers, and the front door opened. Cold air came first, then the scent of rosewater. Lady Penmere entered in deep violet silk under a travelling cloak, lined with sable, not hurried, not disordered, as if she had chosen this hour for a call and expected the room to treat it as one. Mr. Cray followed with a leather case in his hands and disapproval in every line of his face. Behind them stood Clarice in dove-grey bonnet, pretty and pale and avid, taking in the room as if selecting which version of the scene would later play best in drawing-rooms. Conversation thinned by degrees. Heads turned. Charlotte set down the tray carefully, before her fingers could fail her. Lady Penmere's gaze found her and hardened into bright triumph. "There you are." Charlotte did not curtsy. She did not step forward either. The room watched the distance between them. "You left my house under instruction," Lady Penmere said, each word clean and carrying. "You then absconded from your place of employment and attached yourself to strangers in the night. You have my property in your possession. You will return it and come at once." A lie was easiest when it used true edges. Charlotte felt the old reflex rise in her, the one that urged appeasement as quickest path to reduce damage. She swallowed it. "I left with one valise and what belonged to me," she said. Lady Penmere gave a soft laugh, meant for witnesses. "You hear her. She says belonged as if she had independent means. She has stolen household items before. Trifles at first, coin, stationery, then documents she had no right to touch. Her poor father indulged a talent for numbers beyond her station, and now she imagines herself auditor of decent families." Clarice lowered her eyes in a practised mimicry of sorrow. "We have been very patient," Mr. Cray added. Lady Penmere delayed reporting this to protect Miss Murphy's reputation. The widow at the table lifted her head. One clerk muttered, "Ah!" Public shame had a script. Everyone knew where to look when a woman was named thief. Charlotte felt heat flood her face and then drain away. Not this. Not again in a room full of strangers, as if she were refuse to be catalogued and removed. Her hands tightened against her skirt until nails bit skin. Harrow rose from his chair. He did not speak at once. He crossed the room at an even pace and stopped to Charlotte's left, half a step behind, not touching her. The placement was precise, not possession, not distance. Alignment. "Lady Penmere," he said, "state your claim plainly." She gave him a curtsy edged in silk and calculation. "My Lord Harrow, how fortunate! This unfortunate girl has fled with papers from my late husband's estate, and has sought, I fear, to ingratiate herself where she can profit from confusion. I ask only that she be returned to my household, and that my documents be restored." "Your household," Harrow repeated, as if testing the word for structural weakness. "She is my stepdaughter and dependent," Charlotte answered, before he could. "Dependent is not prisoner." Lady Penmere turned her head slightly, smile flattening. "Do not perform spirit in public, child. It does not suit your face." The words landed with old accuracy. Charlotte felt them strike and did not bend. Across the room, Thomas's guard shifted at the stairs, alert but uncertain whether this was quarrel or command. Rain ticked against glass. Somewhere a spoon dropped and rolled. Harrow's voice came low and cold. "What papers?" Lady Penmere spread one gloved hand. "Account books, copied notes, drafts of correspondence. She steals numbers and then mistakes copying for comprehension." Charlotte heard her own pulse in her ears. If she denied the ledgers now, she might delay immediate ruin. If she surrendered them, Lady Penmere would call them forged. Harrow could decide they were nuisance and hand her over to quiet scandal. All roads contained risk. Only one contained truth in writing. Lady Penmere took one step forward. "Charlotte, you will come." Thomas spoke from the stair landing before fear could stop him. "She saved me, ma'am. She has done no wrong here." Lady Penmere looked at him as one might inspect a stain. "You are in pain, boy. Do not involve yourself." Harrow did not glance back. "Mr. Reed, return upstairs." Thomas obeyed at once. Charlotte drew breath. "I will not return under accusation." "If you claim theft, claim it before a magistrate." Clarice gave a small gasp fit for theatre. Lady Penmere's eyes sharpened. "You would drag family into court?" "You already have, only without a bench." That, more than defiance, made the room stir. People leaned in. A teamster grinned despite himself and hid it in his mug. Lady Penmere's nostrils flared. "You ungrateful burden," she said softly. "Fed, clothed, sheltered, and still feral." Charlotte's throat tightened. Burden, the word used so often it had nearly become her second name. She forced her voice steady. "You withheld food as punishment. You closed accounts and sent me publicly for refusals you had arranged. You struck me this morning in the morning room before your daughters." Clarice flushed. "She lies." Harrow spoke without turning his head. "Did you strike her?" Lady Penmere gave a brittle smile. "My lord, discipline within my own household is hardly—" "Did you strike her?" Silence held one beat too long. "I corrected insolence." The answer moved through the room like a draught. Not loud, not deniable. Harrow extended his gloved hand toward Charlotte, palm up, eyes on Lady Penmere. "Miss Murphy, your account books." The request hit her harder than a shout might have. He had heard enough in scattered lines and morning fragments to ask for the one weapon she had guarded for years in secret. If she placed those pages in his hand, she placed her father's last defence, and her own, into an earl's discretion. Men of rank had ruined women for less. Men of rank had also, sometimes, made rooms listen. Charlotte crossed to the sideboard where she had tucked her valise beneath a shelf. Her fingers were clumsy on the clasp. She lifted out the linen-wrapped bundle, twine darkened by damp, at one corner, and held it for one moment against her chest. Her father's ruler lay beneath it, brass cold through fabric. Columns are honest when men are not. She turned back. Lady Penmere's composure cracked by a thin line. "Charlotte, do not be absurd. Those are private household papers." "They are trust records," Charlotte said, "and copies because originals vanish." She placed the bundle in Harrow's gloved hand. The room seemed to stop breathing. Harrow weighed the ledgers once, as if judging not heft, but consequence. He passed them to his secretary, who had appeared near the doorway with ink still on his cuff and surprise suppressed by training. "Seal these," Harrow said, "witnessed by the innkeeper." Mrs. Greeley stepped forward at once, flower on her sleeve, chin high. "I witness." Mr. Cray made a strangled protest. "My lord, you cannot simply seize documents from a guardian." "I can preserve disputed evidence," Harrow said, "and I have." Lady Penmere's smile returned in shards. "On what authority?" He looked at her then, fully, and Charlotte saw several men in the room lower their eyes from reflex. "On mine, until Bow Street states otherwise. You may present your claim there, at noon." Noon, not delayed, not softened, a public room with records. Lady Penmere's cheeks blanched beneath powder. "You presume much." "I observe bruises, admissions, and contested trust accounts. I presume nothing." He turned slightly towards Charlotte, still not touching her. "You will make a sworn statement." Her fear struck low and cold. Sworn meant perjury risk. Sworn meant cross-examination, men with polished boots asking why she had waited, why she had no husband, why she had copied in secret if she had nothing to hide. Sworn meant stepping into open air with no veil left. She heard herself answer anyway. "Yes, my lord." Lady Penmere took one sharp breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "She cannot withstand that room. She never could." Charlotte met her eyes. "Then we will both be tested." Rain thickened again, hard against the shutters, sounding like knuckles on a locked door. Harrow gave one final instruction without raising his voice. "No one removes Miss Murphy from this inn." A pause. Then, to Mrs. Greeley, "Room key remains with her." Mrs. Greeley nodded once. "I?" Lady Penmere drew herself up to full height, silk whispering like warning. "Very well, noon." She turned and moved toward the door with Clarice floating after her, and Mr. Cray clutching his case as if paperwork could still be arranged into obedience. At the threshold, Lady Penmere looked back over one shoulder, expression smooth again, cruelty banked to embers for later use. "This spectacle will not save you, Charlotte." The door shut behind her on wet wind and carriage noise. For several seconds no one spoke. Then taproom sound resumed in fragments, too loud, then lower, the way rooms recover after witnessing something they will repeat for years. Harrow's secretary secured wax over the wrapped ledgers, with Mrs. Greeley's sign scratched beside his. Charlotte watched the seal harden and knew there was no return to silence now. Harrow looked down at her, winter eyes unreadable, jaw set as stone. "It," he said. "Then write every date you remember before noon." She nodded because speech had narrowed to a thread. He turned to go, stopped, and added without looking back, "You did not bend when it was profitable to bend. Keep that discipline." He walked toward the private parlour where dispatches waited, boots quiet on warped boards, coat still damp at the hem. Charlotte stood in the centre of the tap room with flower dust in the air, rose water fading, and the weight of years no longer hidden beneath mattress ticking, but carried into daylight under seal and witness. The seal cooled to a dull red bead on wax, and Charlotte did not trust her knees until she sat. Mrs. Greeley pushed a heel of bread and a wedge of cheese toward her without ceremony, then dropped an ink bottle, a quill, and 3 folded sheets beside the plate. "If you faint, do it after you write," she muttered, though her hand lingered 1 second on Charlotte's shoulder before she went back to shouting at a scullion. Charlotte ate because she had been ordered to eat, and because her body had started to shake in small, humiliating tremors she could no longer hide. The bread was coarse and yesterday's. It tasted like mercy all the same. She kept her eyes on the grain of the table and listened to the room reassemble itself around scandal. Tankards knocked wood, chairs scraped, low voices carried her name and dropped it quickly when she lifted her head. In the private parlour beyond the half-open door, Harrow's voice rose and fell in brief commands, axle repairs, route changes, a rider to Bow Street with notice of appearance at noon, a clerk to fetch copied trust instruments from his London solicitor. Every instruction landed like a nail set straight with one strike. He had moved from confrontation to mechanism with frightening ease, and Charlotte understood why men obeyed him before title was spoken. He made decisions sound like fact. She wiped her fingers on her skirt, uncorked the ink, and bent over the first page. Date, transfer amount, name of account. She wrote in a tight, neat hand, taught at a brighter desk years ago. Her knuckles burned where the skin was split. Ink trembled at first and then steadied as memory took over. June 14th, Maintenance Trust, £80, redirected under emergency repairs that had never occurred. August 3rd, school fees suspended, some moved to private note settled at Club St. James's. November 19th, orchard rent withheld, debtor listed as insolvent though she had seen his receipt in Mr. Cray's drawer. Facts waited. Facts did not blush. By the time the kitchen clock dragged towards 7, the taproom windows had gone from black to pewter, and rain thinned to a fine grey sheet that made the street beyond look painted and far away. Her second page was half filled when the bench opposite her shifted. She looked up and found Harrow seated across the narrow table, greatcoat removed, dark waistcoat still damp at the shoulders. He had left his gloves somewhere. A pale scar ran from his right temple into his hairline, vanishing beneath wet strands combed back by impatient fingers. He did not speak. He simply sat, forearms on his knees, watching her hand move across the paper, as if this too were a field operation requiring his presence. Men like him were never still without purpose. She lowered her gaze and kept writing, acutely aware of him in every nerve. The heat from the hearth did not reach this corner well. The cold in her sleeves had settled into her bones, yet she felt his nearness like banked fire, a contained force held in check by discipline alone. When she reached for the third sheet, the quill slipped on her damp fingers and blotted ink across the margin. A curse rose in her throat and died there. She set the quill down before she snapped it. Harrow reached into his coat pocket and placed a clean handkerchief on the table between them. White linen. Initials stitched in dark thread. No flourish in the gesture, no softening expression to accompany it. He offered aid the way he had offered orders. Direct, unsentimental, not optional. "Dry your hand," he said. "I will soil it." "It is cloth." She pressed the linen to her fingers. The fabric was finer than anything she had touched in years. It came away smudged with ink and a thin line of red where a knuckle had cracked open again. She moved to return it. He did not take it. "Keep writing," she resumed. He remained motionless, not reading over her shoulder, not interrogating, guarding the table as surely as a sentry guarded a gate. Twice men from his staff approached with questions. Twice he answered without rising. Once a traveller wandered near, peering with the idle hunger of strangers toward a quiet pair at a corner table. Harrow turned his head, said nothing, and the man retreated at once. Charlotte finished the third page and set the quill down carefully. "I have listed what I can prove from memory," she said. "The copies in your secretary's possession will supply the columns." Harrow took the pages, scanned the opening lines, and passed them back. "You will read this aloud in court." She stared at him. "You have not even reviewed it." "I have reviewed enough men to know accuracy when I hear it. Your structure is disciplined. You separate what you saw from what you infer. Keep that distinction, and they cannot split you open." No one had ever praised her method in plain words. Not since her father's voice at her shoulder in Dorset. The recognition landed harder than comfort might have. She folded her hands to hide the sudden tremor. "They will ask why I waited," she said. Yes. They will ask why I copied at night if I had honest intent." "Yes, they will ask what I hoped to gain." His eyes did not leave hers. "Answer all three the same way. Survival." The word sat between them with the clean weight of truth. From the doorway came a hesitant cough. Harrow's secretary stood there with a sealed note on a tray, expression professionally blank and therefore immediately ominous. "A message for Miss Murphy, my lord, delivered by Penmere footman, marked urgent." Charlotte's stomach turned. Lady Penmere never wrote unless she could weaponize the ink. Harrow held out his hand. "Leave it." The secretary crossed the room, set down the tray, and withdrew. Charlotte reached for the note. Harrow's hand moved first, not touching hers, simply intercepting with that same battlefield economy. He examined the seal, then looked up. "Do you wish to read this now?" The question startled her by its existence. Choice, offered without mockery. "No," she said after one beat. If it is from her, it is either threat or plea in borrowed language. Both will poison my head before testimony. He nodded once, slid the letter back onto the tray, and pushed it to the far edge of the table. "It will remain unopened until after Bow Street. Witnessed." He raised his voice half a degree. "Mrs. Greeley." The innkeeper appeared at once, wiping her hands. "This note remains sealed in your lockbox until a court adjourns," Harrow said. "You will attest chain of custody if requested." Mrs. Greeley looked from his face to Charlotte's and gave a hard, satisfied nod. I will lock it under my own key." She took the tray and went. Charlotte let out a breath she had not known she held. "Thank you!" Harrow's jaw tightened, as if thanks were an instrument he did not trust in close quarters. "Do not thank me for procedure. Use it." Silence followed. Not empty silence, charged, listening silence. Outside, a carriage rattled past in shallow water. Upstairs, a board creaked under Thomas Reed's guard. Charlotte gathered the pages into one stack. "You are spending influence on a woman you met in rain 3 days ago." "4," he said. She blinked. He continued before she could answer. "Covent Garden, Tuesday, near the Opera Colonnade. You were carrying a basket with mended cuffs. Left boot split at the seam. You stopped at the baker's window and counted coin through your skirt pocket without going in." Heat climbed the back of her neck in a wave that felt almost like vertigo. She had not seen him. She was certain she had not seen him. "You watched me." "Yes." The word was bare, no apology in it. No performance. Why? He leaned back slightly, broad shoulders settling against the bench, and for the first time she saw strain beneath the control, not in his voice, in his hands. They were still now, flat on the table, but the tendons stood out sharply, as if stillness itself cost him. Because you were about to be struck by a carriage wheel when you stepped off the curb to avoid a gentleman's coat, he said. Because you did not eat, though you were swaying on your feet. Because when a draper cheated you, you thanked him. Charlotte felt the old shame flare and then break apart under something more dangerous. To be unseen was one injury. To be seen precisely was another kind of exposure altogether. So you sent your carriage? Yes. At night? Without explanation? Yes. You expected obedience. I expected speed. His gaze held hers, without softening. I expected you to survive the week. The room narrowed around that sentence. She had spent years being named burden, nuisance, expense. Not once had anyone with power spoken survival as if it were obligation owed to her. Her fingers tightened on the papers. You could have sent a woman, a matron, a written note. I know. Yet you did not. A beat passed. Rain whispered against the pane. I am not practised in asking, he said. I am practised in extracting men from fire before beams fall. In my world, delay kills. I treated you as if my command were neutral. It was not. He stopped there, as if the admission had reached a line he did not cross even under pressure. For a man built of rank and restraint, that was confession enough to alter the shape of a room. Charlotte could not look away. Then hear this in equal plainness. I will not enter any carriage again without terms written first. Good, he said. Require terms from everyone. His mouth shifted at one corner. Not a smile. The nearest his face seemed willing to permit. He rose. The movement was swift and controlled. Conversation in the tap-room dipped instinctively at his full height. He placed one hand on the back of her chair, not touching her, creating a boundary against the room. You will not answer to Lady Penmere in corridors, yards, or carriage steps, he said. You will answer only in recorded rooms. The command froze her then, settled in her chest as something like structure, protection disguised in steel syntax, a line drawn where none had ever held for her before. She will attempt private settlement before noon, he continued. She will call it mercy. It will be concealment. You will decline. Yes, my lord. He leaned closer by an inch, not intimate, tactical, so only she could hear the next words. If any person attempts to remove you by force or persuasion, you say one sentence. I am bound to appear at Bow Street at noon and remain under Lord Harrow's protection, pending examination. Then you step behind me. No argument. The phrase was outrageous on her tongue before she even spoke it. Protection had never belonged to her except what she carved from scraps. Yet he had placed formal weight behind her name in public, and now he was giving her language that could not be mistaken for pleading. She nodded once. His hand remained on the chair back. He did not move away. Seconds stretched. She realized with a strange, sharp certainty that he was waiting, not for obedience, but for assent freely given. Another line crossed and marked. I assent, she said, voice low but steady. To procedure, not ownership. His eyes darkened, winter water under cloud. Correct, he said, not ownership. He straightened. The air where he had been seemed colder at once. From the stair came Thomas's voice, thin but clear. My lord, sir? Harrow turned immediately. Stay where you are. Thomas appeared anyway at the landing, one hand on the rail, sling secure, face pale. Forgive me. There is a man below asking after Miss Murphy. Says he is from Bow Street and requires her signature now. Charlotte half rose, pulse kicking hard. Too fast, too convenient. Harrow was already moving. Description. Brown coat, no badge shown. Harrow's expression hardened to something lethal in its calm. He looked back at Charlotte. Sit! She obeyed before thought caught up. He signalled two of his men with one sharp gesture. Rear door, side passage, bring him to the public room if legitimate. If not, he leaves. The men went. Harrow remained where he was, between Charlotte and the main entrance, body angled to cover both line of sight and approach. He did not pace. He did not ask her to hide. He stood in full view, still as carved stone, while the inn held its breath around him. Minutes passed. No one crossed his line. At last one of his men returned, rein on his shoulders. No officer, my lord, groom from Penmere Carriage in a borrowed coat. Claimed confusion when challenged. Name. Would not give one. He is gone. Harrow nodded once. Post watch at both exits until departure for court. He turned back to Charlotte. She had not realised she was gripping the chair seat until her fingers hurt. That was the first attempt, he said. There will be another. Fear moved through her, then settled into a colder, cleaner shape. Not panic now. Readiness. What do I do? He held her gaze. You stop asking permission to survive. The line struck through her like a bell. Irrevocable, not a comfort, not a promise of ease, but an order that redefined the terms she had been taught to live by. In the space after it, he stayed exactly where he was, broad shoulders squared toward the door, one hand resting near the hilt of a travel knife at his belt, and did not move away from her chair until the clock began to toll the half-hour toward Bow Street. When the half-hour finished tolling, Harrow took his hand from the knife hilt and held out Charlotte's shawl as if it were armour. Put this on. We leave now. She rose, gathered her pages, and followed him through the inn's front passage where two of his men had taken post at either door. Mrs. Greeley came from behind the tap with a small iron box and set it on the counter between them. She unlocked it, lifted out the sealed note Lady Penmere had sent, and looked to Charlotte. Still sealed, as ordered. Charlotte nodded. Thank you. Bring it as witness, if you will. I will. Rain still fell, but lighter now, a fine cold veil across Bow Street. Harrow's carriage waited with one horse replaced, fresh leather dark with water. Thomas Reed stood under the inn arch with his arm in sling and his face stubbornly pale, refusing upstairs rest. He bowed awkwardly. I can appear if needed, miss. You will appear only if called, Harrow said. You will not collapse for theatrics. Thomas straightened. No, my lord. The carriage rocked as they climbed in. Harrow sat opposite Charlotte, hat in his hands, gaze fixed not on her, but on the blurred street beyond the glass. She held her witness pages and felt each rut in the road through worn boot soles, gone soft from rain. At Bow Street, constables met them at the steps before Harrow could knock. Lord Harrow, said the senior officer, your rider reached us. The man in borrowed coat was detained near Drury Lane. He named Penmere wages. Recorded? Harrow asked. Recorded. The courtroom smelled of wet wool, old wood, and ink. Lady Penmere stood near the rail in plum silk and widow's composure, Clarice behind her with lowered lashes, Mr. Cray, grey and rigid at her shoulder. They looked like propriety itself until the clerk called the matter and names became facts instead of ornaments. Miss Charlotte Murphy versus Lady Penmere on petition of trust, misappropriation, coercive control, and contested guardianship. Charlotte stepped into the witness box with her knees steady by force. The magistrate, thin-faced and dry-voiced, peered down. You understand the penalty for false testimony. I do, sir. Proceed. She began with dates. She did not rush. She separated what she saw from what she concluded. She named the maintenance trust, the altered transfers, the school fees rerouted, the orchard rent marked insolvent, though paid. Harrow stood behind counsel rail and did not intervene once. When opposing counsel pressed why she waited years to report, she answered exactly as rehearsed. I lacked standing, and I lacked protection. Delay was not deceit. It was survival. He asked why she copied ledgers in secret, if she trusted her own honesty. Because originals were moved and letters were opened, a copy survives theft. He asked what she hoped to gain now. Only what was mine before my father died, no more. Murmurs moved through benches. The magistrate rapped wood once. Silence. Harrow's secretary produced the linen-wrapped ledgers, seal unbroken since the inn. Mrs. Greeley testified to chain of custody. Wax was cut in open court. Pages were turned, compared, marked. Then Harrow's solicitor laid 3 original trust instruments beside Charlotte's copies. Signatures matched at first glance and failed under magnifier. Stroke pressure wrong. Terminal flourish reversed. The clerk's pen scratched furiously. Lady Penmere's counsel rose to object. Forgery allegations require specialist review. A specialist sits present, the magistrate said, nodding towards the court examiner already holding both sheets to the light. You may save breath. Mr. Cray was called. He swore. He tried caution. It lasted 4 questions. Under dates and receipts his answers thinned, then broke. Yes, Lady Penmere had ordered the Mercer account closed before sending Miss Murphy for ribbon. Yes, Miss Murphy's letters had been screened for household harmony. Yes, maintenance funds had covered private debts of urgency. Clarice lifted her chin once, as if to deny him, then looked at the floor and never spoke. The loaded look she had worn in parlours dissolved into silence that explained itself. The sealed note from Lady Penmere to Charlotte was opened last. The magistrate read it aloud because its language mattered. Return at once, sign a private family settlement, withdraw any statement, and all past corrections would be forgiven. A postscript in another hand offered £50 if she departed London within 24 hours. Witness tampering entered the record with no embellishment needed. By 2 o'clock, rain had begun to break against the upper windows, and the magistrate delivered judgment in a voice flat as a blade. Guardianship of Miss Charlotte Murphy is terminated immediately. Lady Penmere is removed from all fiduciary authority pending full civil accounting. Interim control of Miss Murphy's inheritance and remaining properties is restored to Miss Murphy under court supervision. Misappropriated sums are to be repaid from Penmere liquid assets and securities. Fine imposed for falsified instruments and witness interference. Court officers will execute transfer orders today. Lady Penmere's face did not collapse. It hardened into something narrow and metallic. This is theatre, she said. This is record, the magistrate replied. Remove her from argument. Constables stepped forward. Not rough, final. Clarice gave one strangled protest and then followed her mother out, silk dragging through damp sawdust on the floor. Mr. Cray hesitated as he passed Charlotte, as if a confession still sat at the back of his throat, then lowered his eyes and kept walking. He never offered it. When the room emptied to clerks and signatures, Harrow came to Charlotte's side, but did not crowd her. You will never ask permission to survive again. The sentence struck through her fatigue and settled like a post driven deep. Outside on the stone steps, the sky had lifted from iron to pearl. Water still dripped from eaves. She turned to him, throat tight with all she had held for years. Was the carriage mercy or ownership? His jaw locked. For one long breath he looked toward the street where his carriage stood, and then back at her. Neither. It was fear. She did not speak. I saw you in the rain, he said. I calculated wrong. I sent command where I should have sent explanation. I have never sent for anyone twice. From his inner coat he drew a small wrapped packet and placed it in her palm. The cloth fell open to reveal her father's brass seal, cleaned but worn at one edge, and the old field keys sold from Dorset years ago and recovered through the court officer's inventory that afternoon. Metal met skin like a pulse, returned. Recovered from Penmere effects, Harrow said. Logged and released by order. Her fingers closed over them so hard the ridges marked her hand. That evening, court officers entered Penmere House with writ in hand and witnesses at heel. Charlotte stood in the hall where her mother's portrait had been removed years before. Men carried out strong boxes. Inventories were read aloud in dry voices. Plate, bonds, account journals, 2 reticules containing gaming notes, 1 ring of household keys surrendered under protest. Lady Penmere descended once in travel cloak and gloves, looked at Charlotte as if she were still furniture, and then at the constable, barring the door. Bath, she said to him with bitter elegance. By your own arrangement, madam, he answered. Departure tonight. Rose water followed her to the threshold and then vanished into wet dark as her hired carriage rolled away. By the second Monday of April, Charlotte stood in the old Dorset schoolroom with chalk dust on her fingers and 6 clerks' daughters on straight benches, boots polished, hair ribbons plain and clean, copybooks open to first columns. The house was leased in her name under court seal, and the first rent receipt sat in the drawer beside attendance lists and a fresh ledger ruled by her own hand. Munton Peace. Davies, newly hired housekeeper, set a kettle by the stove and nodded toward the lane. He is here, miss. Harrow waited at the doorway in dark coat and travelling mud, hat held against his chest. He had come without escort beyond 1 groom left at the gate. The girls pretended not to stare and failed. Charlotte stepped into the corridor and closed the schoolroom door behind her. You came on lesson day, she said. I was told to arrive where your work is visible. He offered a folded document with ribbons and 2 witness signatures already in place. Not a demand. A petition in proper form for courtship and intention, contingent on her written consent, revocable at will, no transfer of property implied. I ask, he said. I do not summon. She read every line. Her father's ruler lay in her pocket. She used it now to straighten the page against the window frame and checked the clauses twice. When she looked up, he had not moved. My condition remains, she said. No coercion. No private terms hidden from daylight. Accepted. A long courtship. Accepted. If I decline later, you do not punish those under my roof. His opus eyes held hers, winter no longer empty of weather. Accepted. She signed with steady hand and gave him the page. He did not touch her. He only inclined his head, the smallest formal bow made intimate by restraint. From the schoolroom came the scratch of 6 pens, beginning their first sums. Charlotte opened the door and Harrow stepped aside to let her pass first. At the threshold she paused and looked through the window. Rainwater still clung to the glass in bright beads, but beyond the orchard wall the sky had cleared to clean spring light, and for the first time in years no storm stood between her name and her future.